Every civilization textbook you have ever read tells you the same story. The aqueduct was the crowning achievement of ancient engineering. Rome built them, Greece built them, Persia built them. And through these channels, fresh water was delivered to the masses, a gift of civilization to the ordinary person, proof that advanced societies cared for their populations. That is the story. But there is a detail buried inside that story, a detail that has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years, that changes the meaning of everything when you look at it directly. The channels were not made of stone alone, the pipes were not clay, the distribution systems that carried water into the homes and public fountains and bathhouses of the ancient world were lined in enormous quantities with a specific material. A material whose properties were well understood at the time. A material whose effects on the human brain and body were documented by the engineers and scholars of the ancient world themselves. Lead. Not by accident, not because they had no alternatives. Lead was expensive to produce, difficult to work with, and required skilled labour to shape into sheets and pipes. Clay was abundant. Stone channels could move water without any lining at all. Wooden pipes were used across Europe for centuries and worked adequately. And yet, the great civilizations of the ancient world chose lead, specifically and deliberately. When you start asking why, the comfortable story about civilization as a gift to the people begins to crack. And once you see what is underneath that crack, you cannot unsee it. If that question is one you have been sitting with, if you have looked at the scale of ancient construction and felt that the explanation we are given is not quite adequate, then stay with me. Because what we are going to cover in this video is not speculation for its own sake. It is documented, it is in the ancient texts themselves, and it raises a question about who built the old world and what they actually intended it, for that mainstream history has never been willing to answer. Leave a comment before this video ends. Tell me where you are watching from and whether you have ever stood near an ancient aqueduct and felt that something about the official explanation was missing. I read every comment. The ones that ask the right questions shape what comes next. There is a document that the Roman engineering establishment produced in the last decades of the 1st century, before the Common Era. It is called De Architectura, written by the architect and military engineer Marcus Vitruvius Pollio. The work is 10 books long and covers everything from the principles of city planning to the construction of war machines. Book 8 concerns itself with water, specifically with the sourcing, transport and distribution of fresh water to Roman cities. In the chapter on the materials used for water pipes, Vitruvius writes something that has troubled scholars who have read it carefully, and that is almost never quoted in popular histories of Roman engineering. He writes that water conducted through lead pipes is harmful to the human body. He observes that workers who make lead pipes are pallid. He notes that the substance of lead is damaging when absorbed into the body. He recommends clay pipes as the superior option for public health. Read that again slowly. The engineer who wrote the foundational text of Roman construction, the man whose work was so authoritative that architects were still consulting it during the Renaissance, 15 centuries after it was written, told his readers explicitly that lead pipes were bad for the people who drank from them. He identified the specific harm. He recommended an alternative. And then, across the next 4 centuries of Roman dominance, the empire built hundreds of thousands of miles of lead pipe anyway. The Aqua Claudia, one of the most celebrated engineering achievements in Roman history, stretched across 69 kilometers of countryside before entering Rome through its famous arched section and distributing water across the city through lead pipes. The Aqua Marcia, considered by the Romans themselves to be the finest water in Rome, ran its water through a distribution system heavily laced with lead fistulae, the lead pipes that connected the main channel to individual homes and fountains. The Castellum Divisorium, the distribution tanks at the endpoint of every major aqueduct, were lined with lead sheeting. The pipes that ran from them to private homes were lead. The fistulae that tapped the public mains to supply individual properties were lead. The private cisterns in elite homes were lead-lined. This was not an oversight. This was not ignorance. This was a civilization that knew what it was doing and did it anyway. The question of why has an easy answer and a harder one. The easy answer is that lead was simply the most workable material available. It could be melted and cast into pipes more easily than bronze. It was cheaper than copper. It did not corrode in the way iron did. It was malleable enough to be bent and joined in the field without specialized equipment. These are all true things. They are the answers that mainstream history provides when pressed on the lead question. And they are answers that conveniently close the discussion before it goes anywhere uncomfortable. The harder answer, I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Answer requires looking at what lead actually does to a population over generations. Lead is a neurotoxin. It does not kill quickly. It does not produce an obvious acute illness in the person drinking it at the concentrations typically found in lead-contaminated water supplies. What it does, over years and decades of chronic exposure, is alter the functioning of the brain in ways that are measurable, documented, and consistent across every population that has been studied. Lead exposure suppresses the production of neurotransmitters involved in executive function, impulse control, and long-term planning. It reduces the capacity for complex abstract reasoning. It increases baseline aggression while simultaneously impairing the kind of organized, goal-directed thinking that makes resistance, coordination, and collective action possible. In children, the effects are most dramatic. A population drinking from lead-contaminated sources for multiple generations will, within 2 or 3 generations, show measurable reductions in average cognitive capacity, measurable increases in impulsive behavior, and measurable reductions in the capacity for the kind of organized, patient, strategic thinking that political organization and resistance require. The lead and Rome connection is not a fringe theory. It has been published in peer-reviewed literature. S. T. Gilfillan raised the question formally in 1965 in the Journal of Occupational Medicine, arguing that lead poisoning contributed systematically to the decline of the Roman ruling class. A landmark 1994 study published in the journal Science, drawing on ice core data from Greenland, demonstrated measurable spikes in atmospheric lead levels that correlated precisely with periods of peak Roman industrial and manufacturing activity. The lead was real. The exposure was real. The question of intent is the only part of the discussion that history refuses to enter. Because if you ask the intent question, you have to ask it in the context of who was exposed and who was not. And this is where the story becomes something different from a public health debate. The distribution of water in ancient Rome was not egalitarian. The sources varied dramatically in their lead content depending on how they were delivered. Spring water brought through stone channels from distant sources and stored in clay-lined cisterns had minimal lead contamination. Water that passed through the extensive lead distribution network of the urban system had significant contamination by the time it reached the endpoint user. Private homes of the wealthy were often supplied by dedicated lead pipes tapping the main directly, but they could also afford to maintain private clay storage vessels and to source drinking water separately from bathing water. The public fountains, the public bathhouses, the public latrines, where the mass of the urban population interacted with the water system, were endpoints of the lead distribution network. The elite of Rome sourced spring water from specific sources that were known to be of high quality and that were distributed to elite neighborhoods through systems that were monitored and maintained. The general population drank what came through the system. The system was lead. This pattern is not unique to Rome. It appears wherever the great aqueduct building civilizations built their water infrastructure. The Persian Qanat system, the underground channels that supplied water across the arid plateau of Iran for thousands of years, used lead fittings at its distribution endpoints. Carthage, whose aqueduct system supplied what was, at its height, the largest city in the western Mediterranean, used lead pipe extensively in its urban distribution network. The Byzantine Empire, which inherited the Roman infrastructure and maintained and expanded it across 1,000 years, continued using lead in its water distribution without interruption. These are not isolated cases of an engineering culture making a suboptimal material choice. This is a consistent pattern across civilizations that were, in other respects, sophisticated enough to produce the most precisely engineered structures in the ancient world. Which brings us to the question that the Tartaria hypothesis asks that conventional history will not. Who actually built these systems? Take the aqueduct of Zagouan in what is now Tunisia. It runs for 132 kilometers from its source at the springs of Zagouan to the city of Carthage, making it one of the longest aqueducts ever constructed in the ancient world. Its engineering precision is extraordinary. The gradient required to move water across 132 kilometers of varied terrain, maintaining constant pressure and flow without pumps, requires surveying and calculation that modern civil engineers respect and study. The Romans are credited with building it, and the conventional dating puts its construction in the mid-2nd century of the Common Era. But the construction of a 132-kilometer channel at precise gradient through mountainous terrain, incorporating arched bridge sections, tunnel sections, and varied geological conditions, is not the work of an administration that existed for a few hundred years. It is the work of an engineering tradition that had solved these problems so thoroughly that they could execute them at scale as routine infrastructure. The Romans we know from history, the Rome of Trajan and Hadrian when the Zagouan aqueduct was supposedly built, were a militarized administrative state running an economy on slave labor. What we know of their engineering education and practice does not convincingly explain the precision of what they are credited with building. The same observation applies to the Pont du Gard in southern France, 49 meters high, the tallest Roman bridge in existence, 3 tiers of arches with the individual blocks of dressed stone set without mortar and relying solely on the precision of their cutting and placement to hold together across 2,000 years of temperature variation, seismic activity, and flooding. The stone blocks of the upper tier weigh up to 6 tons. They were moved and positioned without any lifting machinery that Roman engineering texts describe as existing. The precision of the arch construction, with the voussoir stones cut to tolerances that ensure the arch distributes load correctly without mortar bonding, requires a mathematical understanding of arch mechanics that Roman texts do not clearly demonstrate. The conventional explanation is that Roman engineers were simply very skilled and that we are underestimating what was possible with organized labor and basic tools. This is the explanation that is always given, and it always has the effect of closing the question before it reaches its natural conclusion. The natural conclusion is that these structures were not built by the civilization we associate with them. They were found, inherited, or modified by the civilization we associate with them. And the water infrastructure, the lead lining, the distribution network, was part of a system designed by whoever actually built these structures for a purpose that the inheriting civilization either understood and continued or did not fully understand and simply maintained because it was there and it worked. The Tartaria hypothesis proposes, in its various forms, that there was a prior global civilization of extraordinary technical capacity, one that left its architectural fingerprints across every continent in the form of structures that the subsequent civilizations claimed credit for but could not have produced from scratch. The aqueducts are part of that fingerprint. The lead lining is part of that system. And the purpose of the lead in this framework is not an accident of material choice or a failure of public health awareness. It is a designed feature of a system whose purpose was not primarily water delivery. What was it then? There are several lines of thinking here, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is the population management hypothesis. a civilization with sufficient technical knowledge to understand the neurological effects of lead, and with sufficient control. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment now, then come back. Control over water infrastructure to design its distribution network could use that infrastructure to produce a cognitively suppressed, high compliance population. The effects of chronic low-level lead exposure on impulse control, long-term planning and collective action capacity are precisely the effects that make a population easier to administer. You do not need violent suppression of a population that lacks the cognitive architecture for organized resistance. You just need to maintain the water system. This is not a gentle reading of history, but it is a reading that becomes available once you accept the documented facts. Vitruvius knew lead was harmful. Rome built lead infrastructure anyway. The infrastructure disproportionately exposed the mass of the population. The effects of that exposure across generations are neurologically and behaviorally consistent with a more compliant, less organizationally capable population. The logic is there. The question is whether it was intended. The second line of thinking concerns the energetic properties of lead itself. This is territory that conventional physics does not readily enter, but that the alternative history and suppressed technology community has explored in connection with the broader framework of old world architecture as an energy system rather than a series of unconnected engineering projects. Lead has specific electromagnetic properties. It is a superconductor at very low temperatures, which is not relevant to ambient conditions, but it also has significant properties as a radiation shield and as a conductor of certain types of low-frequency electromagnetic phenomena. In the framework that proposes old world architecture as a free energy distribution system, functioning through principles related to telluric currents, ley lines, or the properties of stone and water, in combination, the lead lining of water channels takes on a different meaning. It is not a plumbing material. It is a functional component of a system that uses the movement of water through a specifically prepared channel to produce or conduct a form of energy that the old world civilization understood and used. This framework is speculative. It is honest to say that. But it is also honest to say that the mainstream dismissal of it has not been accompanied by a satisfying explanation of why structures built by pre-industrial civilizations with the tools attributed to them could produce the precision and scale that we observe. The third line of thinking focuses on what has been found buried under aqueduct systems and what those findings suggest about the ground level at the time of construction. The mud flood hypothesis, which proposes that a catastrophic event in the relatively recent past buried the lower levels of old world structures under a layer of sediment and debris, is relevant here because aqueducts provide a specific test case. An aqueduct is designed to move water by gravity. Its gradient is everything. If you build an aqueduct with a specific gradient to deliver water to a specific destination, the destination must be at the elevation the aqueduct was designed to reach. If subsequent investigation reveals that the receiving end of the aqueduct's channel is now partially below ground level, or that the arched sections that should be above ground to maintain the water's elevation are partially buried in earth, then one of two things has happened. Either the aqueduct was always partially underground, which defeats its function, or the ground level has changed since the aqueduct was built. In several documented cases, sections of Roman aqueducts are found with their lower arch portions buried in accumulated sediment and debris to depths that suggest a significant ground level raising event. The accepted explanation is gradual natural silting and the accumulation of centuries of debris. This explanation works for some cases and strains credibility in others, where the buried sections are too extensive and too uniform to be explained by gradual accumulation without positing an event. If the ground level of the ancient world was significantly lower than the current ground level, then the aqueducts were built to supply water at what would now be subgrade elevations. The civilization that built them was not living at the current surface, it was living at the pre-mud flood surface. The structures we see above ground today, the arches, the stone channels, the distribution infrastructure, are the upper portions of systems whose lower elements are buried. The lead distribution piping, the distribution tanks, the urban delivery network is under the current ground level, which is why we do not find it intact, which is why the continuous network is missing, which is why the distribution endpoints, where the lead pipes carried water to actual users, are so rarely found in anything but fragmentary condition. The civilization that built these systems is not the one that inherited them. The one that inherited them looked at the arched stone structures emerging from the ground and understood them as infrastructure that could be repurposed. The lead lining was already there. The distribution principle was already clear. You connect to the existing system, you run your pipes to the existing endpoints, and you operate the infrastructure without necessarily understanding what it was originally designed to accomplish. The behavioral and cognitive effects of the lead in this reading are a product of the original design, not of the inheriting civilization's decisions. Whether those effects were intended by the original builders and what they would have gained from a cognitively suppressed inheritor population is a question that the alternative history framework handles differently depending on the researcher you are reading. The more restrained interpretations propose that the lead was a functional material choice for reasons we have not yet identified. The less restrained interpretations propose that the original civilization maintained the subsequent populations in a managed state for purposes that relate to resource extraction, labor organization, or control of the post-catastrophe recovery process. What none of these interpretations require is the assumption that the official history is complete. The official history requires you to believe that Rome built one of the most precisely engineered water delivery systems in the ancient world, while its engineers publicly documented that the primary material used in that system was harmful to the people it served. It requires you to believe that this choice was made for reasons of cost and convenience by a civilization sophisticated enough to calculate the gradient of a 100-kilometer aqueduct to centimeter level precision, but not sophisticated enough to implement a clay distribution network in the receiving city. It requires you to believe that the pattern of lead use, appearing consistently across every major aqueduct civilization, is a coincidence of independent engineering traditions all arriving at the same suboptimal material choice. The longer you sit with those requirements, the less comfortable they become. There is a scholar named Jerome Nuriagu who published a book in 1983 titled Lead and Lead Poisoning in Antiquity. Nuriagu was a geochemist, not a fringe theorist. His argument, backed by quantitative analysis of lead production and distribution data from the ancient world, was that the Roman aristocracy and the broader Roman population was systematically exposed to levels of lead that would produce measurable cognitive impairment. He estimated that the average Roman aristocrat, through a combination of lead-lined cookware, lead-sweetened wine stored in lead vessels, and lead-piped water, consumed enough lead daily to produce diagnosable chronic lead poisoning. His work was published by a mainstream academic press, reviewed in mainstream journals, and then largely set aside by the historical establishment without being substantively refuted. The setting aside of Nuriagu's work is not because it was wrong, it is because it was inconvenient. Because if the cognitive impairment of the Roman population by its own infrastructure was as extensive as his data suggested, then the standard narrative of Roman decline becomes inadequate. You cannot explain the collapse of Roman administrative capacity, military coherence, and political rationality across the 3rd and 4th centuries purely through the conventional factors of barbarian pressure, fiscal crisis, and political instability. You have to include the possibility that the people making the decisions were neurologically compromised by the infrastructure they were living inside. And once you include that possibility, you have to ask who built the infrastructure. And once you ask that, you are no longer operating inside the comfortable boundaries of mainstream ancient history. Consider also the geographic reach of this pattern and what it requires you to believe about how it spread. The Iberian Peninsula, under Roman administration from roughly the 2nd century before the Common Era, had its own extensive aqueduct network. The aqueduct of Segovia in what is now central Spain, with its 818 arches and its perfectly preserved two-tiered arcade standing 28 metres at its highest point, carried water across nearly 17 kilometres from the Frio River to the city. It is one of the best preserved Roman structures in the world precisely because it was maintained continuously for 2 millennia by successive populations who found it useful and kept it in service. The granite blocks of its arcade are set without mortar. The precision of their cutting and fitting is such that the structure has remained structurally sound through 2,000 years of seismic activity, seasonal flooding, and the weight of the water it carried. The distribution network that received its water at the city end was lead. As always, as everywhere, the aqueduct of Caesarea Maritima in what is now Israel carried water from the springs at the foot of Mount Carmel to the coastal city that Herod the Great built as his administrative capital. 2 aqueduct channels running side by side supplied the city across a span of centuries from the late 1st century before the Common Era into the Byzantine period. The lead fistulae recovered from the distribution network of Caesarea in excavations over the last several decades are consistent in their dimensions and production techniques with lead pipe recovered from aqueduct systems in Spain, in North Africa, in Gaul, and in Britain. The standardization is remarkable. These are not independent engineering traditions arriving at the same material choice through coincidence. The dimensional standards of lead pipe in the Roman world were regulated. The Frontinus Report, a surviving administrative document from the Water Commissioner of Rome at the end of the 1st century, specifies pipe dimensions in a standardized system that was applied across the empire. Lead pipe of specific gauges was manufactured to specification. It was transported to construction sites. It was installed according to standardized procedures. This level of administrative standardization requires not just engineering knowledge but institutional continuity, record-keeping systems, a supply chain for the raw material, and trained labour that could read and implement specifications consistently across thousands of kilometres of territory. The Romans had all of this. The question that the scale of the system raises is whether they developed it independently from the beginning or whether they inherited it from an earlier administrative system whose physical infrastructure they found in place and whose specifications they continue to follow without necessarily understanding all the reasoning behind those specifications. The Latin word for lead is plumbum. It gives us the English words plumber and plumbing, a linguistic trace of the material's central role in ancient water infrastructure. The word itself is not of clear Latin derivation. Etymologists have traced it to possible Iberian or pre-Roman Mediterranean origins, suggesting that it entered Latin from a language spoken in the Western Mediterranean before Roman dominance, a language spoken by people who were already working with lead for water infrastructure before Rome expanded into their territory. The Romans may have adopted not just the material but the word for it from a pre-existing technical tradition they encountered and incorporated. Languages carry the sediment of history the way soil carries the sediment of occupation. When a technical vocabulary arrives in a language without clear native roots, it often means that the technical practice arrived from outside, from a source culture that the inheriting culture absorbed. The Romans learned from the Greeks in many domains. The Greeks, in the domain of water engineering, had their own lead pipe traditions going back to the 5th century before the Common Era, with excavated lead pipes from Athens, from Corinth, from the sanctuary sites of the Aegean Islands. The question of where the Greek tradition originated is the same question that the Roman tradition opens. It leads backward through time to a point where the documentary record runs out and the physical evidence in the ground becomes the only available testimony. You are standing at the edge of something that the established historical narrative has been carefully constructed to prevent you from seeing. The lead is in the channels. The channels are in the ground, some of them buried under 10 and 20 feet, of what mainstream archaeology classifies as gradual accumulation. The scholars who raised the most serious questions about what this means were published and then sidelined. The structures that could not have been built with the tools attributed to their builders are attributed to their builders anyway, because the alternative is a question that institutional history is not organized to answer. What you do with this is yours to determine. The information is there, the ancient texts are there, the neurological data is there, the archaeological record is there, buried under the ground level of a world whose surface was significantly altered in an event that mainstream history does not have a comfortable name for. What the channels were lined with is a matter of record. What they were for is still a question. And that question, if enough people start asking it seriously and following it where it actually leads, has implications for how we understand not just the ancient world, but the world we are living in right now. The architecture of management is older than we are told. The tools of it are subtler than we recognize. And some of them are still in the ground beneath us in cities that were built on top of a previous civilization's infrastructure, carrying a previous civilization's intentions through pipes we inherited and never questioned. If this is the kind of history you want to keep digging into, you are in the right place. Drop a comment below telling me which ancient site you think deserves the same level of scrutiny as the aqueducts. There are dozens of candidates, and the research that needs to be done on each of them is significant. The ones that keep coming up in the comments tend to be the ones I cover next. The channels were lined with lead. That is not a theory. That is history. What it means is the question history does not want you to ask,